Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Horror Mine. My name is Vic Shy, and this is the Scare Score, where I break down horror movies and rate them on how scary I think they are. In this episode, I'll be going over the 2001 horror movie classic, The Others. As usual, I'll be going over the events that take place throughout the film and rating the scares based on how effective they are or attempt to be. The Others is a classic horror film with an amazing and shocking plot twist that will leave you in awe. But how scary is it? Sit back and relax and join me as we explore The Others and tally up the Scare Score. Our movie begins with a narration from our main character, Grace, telling her children how God created the earth in 7 days. The opening credits show some eerie drawings of our characters and display different moments throughout the film. The music is haunting, and the pictures are creepy, making for an effective opening to this movie. The Others takes place in 1945, shortly after the end of World War II. Our main character, Grace, brilliantly portrayed by Nicole Kidman, wakes up screaming from a nightmare. We are then introduced to three characters: housekeeper Bertha Mills, gardener Edmund Tuttle, and their mute assistant Lydia. Bertha says that Lydia can handle her own and is older than she looks, a subtle clue for events revealed later in the film. Grace has just hired them as the old servants all mysteriously disappeared a week ago. As she describes, they simply vanished. We learn that her husband Charles went off to war a year and a half ago and hasn't returned. Grace tells them that no door in the house can be opened without the previous one being closed. The house has no electricity as the Germans kept shutting it off during the war and they have adapted to live without it. A far better reason than me simply forgetting to pay the electricity bill. Bertha tells her that there is no need to give them a tour of the entire house, but Grace insists on doing so. She tells them to close all the curtains and lights up a lantern. We meet her two totally not creepy children, Anne and Nicholas, who have an unknown disease that make them sensitive to light. While having breakfast, the children have a conversation with Bertha where Anne tells her that mommy went mad. Nicholas tells her to be quiet and Grace walks into the room before Anne can specify what she meant.
What's going on?
Grace walking from the darkness into the light gave her an eerie and almost villainous demeanor. Grace learns that Bertha and company have previously worked as servants in the house years ago. This is why she said earlier that they didn't need a tour of the house. Grace tells Bertha that she doesn't like strange ideas, referring to talks of the supernatural. She walks back into the kitchen where Anne eerily tells her this.
It did happen.
Grace is a very religious person and tries passing her beliefs onto her children. She says that children who don't tell the truth will be sent to limbo after their deaths.
Pain. Forever.
She tells them to study in separate rooms and Nicholas expresses his fear of ghosts, which Grace doesn't believe in. She says the Lord is always with him and there is no reason to be afraid. He then proceeds to immediately become afraid. Grace asks Bertha how Lydia became mute, but she doesn't give her an answer. She hears the sound of a child crying, but it isn't coming from either of her children. Anne tells her that it was a boy named Victor who lives in the house. She says Victor lives in the house with his parents, but Grace doesn't believe her. She notices an unlocked door that Anne says Victor used to leave the room, but Grace blames the servants for leaving it unlocked. She scolds the servants and says that leaving doors unlocked is a matter of life and death for her children. She fears that leaving a door unlocked will tempt them to walk out and expose them to light. Nicholas asks Anne about Victor and she says that he is not a ghost. She says that ghosts walk around wearing white sheets and look sort of like this.
Rawr, rawr, I'm the Flying Dutchman.
That night, Anne scares her brother by telling him Victor is hiding behind the curtains. She starts having a conversation with Victor, but Nicholas thinks she's pretending to be the other voice. She tells Victor to touch his cheek to prove that he's real, and someone actually does. Grace hears Nicholas screaming and runs into the room. Anne swears that she didn't do anything, but Grace punishes her by making her read from the Bible. This entire scene was really well done and felt very tense despite nothing too crazy actually happening. 3 days later, Anne is still being punished as Grace wants her to ask for forgiveness. She mentions that Lydia has been running around upstairs causing a ruckus and asks Bertha to tell her to stop. Bertha goes outside to speak to Lydia and Grace suddenly hears the sound of running footsteps directly above her. Damn it, Bertha, you had one job. Wait a minute. She asks Anne about the noise, but she is reluctant to talk about it, having just gotten in trouble. Because this is a horror movie, Grace walks into a room full of furniture covered in, you guessed it, white sheets. If that was my house, most of these sheets would have been covered in stains only visible in ultraviolet light. She begins to hear breathing and whispers all around her. She removes all the sheets and sees the door behind her closing on its own. She rushes outside and hears noises all around the house as if several people were occupying it, and says that they say that this house is theirs and that they are going to take all the curtains down. Grace doesn't believe there are ghosts, but rather actual intruders inside of the house, and shows her a drawing of the other family supposedly living there: the father, the mother, Victor, and a creepy old lady whom she's seen 14 times. Grace grabs a double-barreled shotgun and searches the house with the servants. A face appears directly behind her that turns out to just be a painting, but still managed to catch me off guard. She doesn't find any intruders, but does find a creepy book filled with pictures of dead people. Bertha tells her that it's a book of the dead and their pictures were taken so that their souls would go on living through the portraits. She tells Grace that the death of a loved one can lead people to do the strangest things. She talks about her previous time working in the house and says she originally evacuated from the island because of an outbreak of tuberculosis. She says that Lydia stopped talking around that time, but she doesn't know the exact cause of what happened to her. That night, Grace apologizes to a seemingly asleep Anne for being so hard on her. Nicholas asks about his dad, and she says that he will return when the war is over. In a tragic scene, Grace breaks down in tears while clinging onto one of her husband's coats. She then hears the sound of the piano playing on its own. The door shuts on its own and she proceeds to lock the piano with a key. The door slams in her face and locks her out of the room. She screams at Bertha to bring her the keys, and once back inside of the room, sees that the piano is open again. She now believes that something not human and not at rest is occupying the house. Bertha says that she also believes in the supernatural and that the world of the dead can sometimes mix with the living. Grace rushes outside and says she is going to bring a priest to bless the house. She tells Mr. Tuttle to search the grounds for gravestones with one of the names on there possibly belonging to Victor. We learn that the servants are up to something as we see Mr. Tuttle purposely hiding the gravestones that Grace told him to look for. She wanders out into the woods that quickly become covered in a thick fog. In a surprising and touching scene, she reunites with her husband Charles. Having just returned from war, he seems empty and emotionless. He tells her that he's been out there looking for his home and
sometimes I bleed.
She introduces Charles to Bertha, who seems genuinely shocked that he's returned. He looks around the house seemingly very confused and reunites with his children, who are overjoyed and in disbelief that their father has finally returned. Something that I unfortunately can't say about mine. Charles is very distant from his family as the war has undoubtedly changed him in ways we could never imagine. During dinner, Anne asks where people go after dying from the war. Though her intent is naive in nature, she asks a very mature question. In war, how do you tell the good side from the bad? Anne once again brings up the intruders, which angers Grace. Anne begins breathing heavily, and Grace angrily tells her to stop breathing in response.
Stop breathing!
Anne storms out of the room crying and is comforted by Bertha. Bertha says that she's also seen the intruders and that Grace will see them sooner or later. She cryptically says that once Grace sees the intruders, things are going to change. Later that night, Bertha and Tuttle have a conversation about the family. She says Grace is going to give them problems, but that Anne will be easier to convince. She says that Charles doesn't suspect a thing and doesn't even know where he is. Grace dresses Anne in a white dress and veil for her first communion, and she ironically depicts her own description of what ghosts are supposed to look like. She begins playing with her puppets on the floor despite her mother telling her not to sit on the ground. Grace walks back into the room and sees that Anne has been replaced by a creepy old lady.
You mad? I am your daughter.
She starts choking the old lady, who is revealed to be Anne after all. Bertha rushes into the room and Anne accuses her mother of trying to kill her. This was a very creepy scene that holds dark implications towards the film's ending. Bertha says that she left Anne in her father's care and asks Grace about what happened. She becomes suspicious of Bertha and tosses the pills that she's been giving her for migraines. She walks into the bedroom and Charles says that Anne told him everything. He questions her about what happened that day, hinting at a separate event event from what just took place. Anne tells Nicholas that she went mad just like she did that day, referencing the same separate incident. Nicholas says that he doesn't remember the incident, though he clearly does. Charles says that he only came back to say goodbye to his wife and kids and that he must return to the front. Grace loses it and says that she wishes he'd never gone to war in the first place. She believes that he not only left to fight the war, but to get away from her. Charles embraces and makes love to his wife one last time before leaving for good. Grace wakes up to an empty spot next to her and realizes that Charles is gone. One thing I absolutely love about this film is the beautifully haunting musical score. Maybe I should start a new show rating films based on their music. I'll call it The Score. The children wake up screaming to find that all the curtains in the house have disappeared. Grace rushes them out of the light and goes looking for them. Bertha says that maybe the children have been cured of their condition. Grace holds Bertha at gunpoint and demands they give her the keys and leave. They nonchalantly walk out of the house and Bertha tells him to go uncover the graves. Grace turns the house upside down for the curtains that are nowhere to be found. Anne says that their mom has gone mad and decides to sneak out of the house to go look for their father. Nicholas follows behind her and the two stumble upon 3 gravestones. At the same time, Grace searches Bertha and Lydia's beds and makes a shocking discovery. She finds a picture of the 3 servants who passed away in 1891 and uncovers the gravestones belonging to the servants as they slowly start to approach them. Grace tries blowing them away with the boomstick, which has no effect. Bertha reveals that they all died from tuberculosis. She locks them out of the house, successfully banking on them not being able to just walk through the doors. Bertha says that the living and the dead must all learn to live together. The children make their way upstairs and hide inside of a closet. Bertha says that the intruders are now inside of the house and are the ones who took the curtains down. Nicholas starts breathing heavily, and just like Grace did earlier, Anne tells him to stop breathing. They hear a woman telling them to come with us, and an old woman suddenly opens the closet. Grace heads upstairs to confront the intruders, and the film's shocking plot twist is finally revealed. She walks into the room and sees a group of people sitting around the table, including the blind old woman that Anne spoke of. The old woman is speaking directly to the children and writing their responses on a piece of paper being read aloud by the man sitting next to her. We learn that Grace and the children have been dead the entire film and that they were actually the ghosts haunting the house the whole time. Lady Stark tells her husband that she is terrified and refuses to live in a haunted house. She reveals that Grace went mad and smothered her 2 children with a pillow before shooting herself. She possibly went insane from waiting for her husband that she thought may never return from the war. She was also taking pills given by Bertha throughout the film, possibly hinting at mental illness. We learn that the old lady was at one point possessed by Anne, which explains why Grace saw the old lady in the white dress and veil. The father says that they will leave the house in the morning, and the mother gets up to go check on Victor. Grace embraces her children and confesses that she didn't initially realize what she had done. Once she realized what she did, she grabbed a rifle and took her own life. I believe that this is the event that led directly into the opening scene of the film when Grace wakes up screaming from an unseen nightmare, that nightmare being the death of her and her children at her own hands. Bertha says that Lydia reacted the same way Grace is now when she realized that they had passed away years ago, which is why she stopped talking. Bertha says that the intruders are leaving, but that others will come and go, as it's always been. She has learned to live in the house as a ghost among the living, something that Grace and her children will now have to do. Nicholas realizes that their father died in the war and wonders if they will ever see him again, and asks her mother about limbo, but Grace admits that she doesn't even know if it exists. This sudden revelation has put everything she has ever known and her faith into question. She says that this is their house, showing that she plans on staying there with her children, the servants, and the future others forever. Now, with a plot twist this juicy, let's take a look back at some of the subtle clues that hinted at this shocking ending. We now know that Bertha and company arrived soon, if not immediately after the deaths of Grace and the children. Their goal throughout the film was to slowly guide Grace into realizing what she had done and that she and the children were dead. The servants arrived at the house with the job posting never being sent to the newspaper. Bertha subtly hints at their age when she says that Lydia is older than she looks, and repeatedly mentions her mother having gone mad. This shot of Grace walking from the darkness into the light possibly hinted at her villainous nature. She walked in on the conversation before Anne could reveal too much about the event. While speaking to Nicholas about Victor, she directly tells him and the audience that Victor is not a ghost. She describes ghosts as wearing white sheets, something she ironically reflects when wearing her white dress and imitating a ghost. While looking at the Book of the Dead, Bertha tells Grace that the death of a loved one can lead people to do the strangest things. This hints directly to the heinous act committed by Grace at the loss of her husband. When Grace reunites with Charles in the forest, he tells her that he has been looking for his home. His soul was wandering the earth after his death, looking for his home so that he could say goodbye to his family. He even cryptically tells her that sometimes he bleeds, something that Grace doesn't catch on to. When Anne asks her mother where people go when they die during war, she was unknowingly directly referencing her own father. During this same scene, Anne starts breathing in anger and Grace literally tells her to stop breathing. Anne tells Nicholas the same thing when they're hiding in the closet, these two quotes referencing the exact way that the children died: suffocation. Grace has been trying to hide her children from the light the entire film, stating they have a disease that can possibly kill them if they're exposed to it. They were exposed to light on 2 separate occasions and were totally fine because they're already dead, something Bertha was trying to hint to Grace when the curtains went missing. Finally, after realizing they're dead, the children ask their mother about limbo, limbo being the place where she said children go after their deaths. It was mentioned very early in the film, subtly hinting at the fact that the children were already dead. In an oddly satisfying conclusion, the children are finally able to expose themselves to the light. As she stares out of the window, Grace embraces her 2 children and says that no one could make them leave the house. In the film's final scene, Victor makes a pretty ugly face while looking at the house and presumably at Grace and the children. He and his family drive away from the haunted house as a man closes the gate, revealing a for sale sign as the movie ends. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was The Others. My friends, this was a truly enjoyable film with an amazing plot twist. With the isolated setting, this was a very self-contained horror film led by an outstanding performance from Nicole Kidman. With that said, The Others isn't the most terrifying film you'll ever see. The film has a few scares spread throughout, but nothing that's going to make you go to sleep clutching onto your SpongeBob SquarePants plushie. The scares that are present aren't revolutionary, but are still presented in an effective way, earning The Others a modest scare score of 50%. The scariest scene in the film is when Grace sees her daughter as the old blind lady wearing the dress. It was pretty unexpected, and the way the old lady says, "I am your daughter," in Anne's voice was horrifying. But, as always, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you all for tuning in, and I cannot wait to see y'all right back here in the Horror Mine next year. Happy holidays and Happy New Year. Y'all stick around.